but actually that's partly the choice of the translator to change it, because of course Clarimonde we know is the name of the main female character in this story. But the actual original French title is up here. La Mort Amoureuse, and to translate that for you, the reason it's tricky is because in French you have masculine and feminine. So this tells you the dead lover, but in French, in English, if it said the dead lover, we wouldn't know whether that was male or female, right? So the French title tells us amoureuse and morte are both feminine, so they say to us, oh, this is a dead woman who is the lover. So it would be very awkward to translate it as the dead female lover, right? So I think the translator probably tried and then was like, no, I'm just going to call it Clarimonde, right? It's easier to give the name of the female protagonist rather than to try to translate this more difficult title, right? So La Mort Amoureuse means the dead lover, but specifically the dead female lover or the dead woman, right? So some different translations of the story do try to translate this more literal title, but it always sounds kind of awkward in English to translate this title. So that's why why this translator has gone with Clarimonde. Okay, so this is a new writer for us. I can see him there. Théophile Gautier. Remember, we always start by thinking a bit about context. So where is Gautier from? Right, he's French, right? And so therefore we can also compare him to other French writers. Mainly we've looked at Balzac in terms of French writers, but of course there are many other French romantic writers that are also very famous, right? And Gautier himself, part of the context to know is that he was actually friends with a lot of the leading French romantic writers, right? So particularly Nerval and who you probably haven't heard of, but Victor Hugo, right? We talked about his play Hernani last time that caused the riot, but of course he's very famous as well for his novels Notre Dame de Paris, also known as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Les Miserables, right? Those very, very famous novels of the Romantic period, right? So Gautier, he's friends with some of the other leading French Romantic writers, right? What year was this story published? 1836. All right, you've got your syllabus on hand, right? 1836. Now, Gautier was born in 1811, so this means that he published this story when he was only 25. So this is one of his earlier works, right? So he went on to do a lot of writing in all sorts of different styles and genres. He was a poet, right? He wrote plays. He wrote some novels. In fact, in my PhD dissertation, I wrote about one of his novels. It actually has quite a number of themes in common with the last story we looked at, Sarrasine, because it's the title of his novel is about Mademoiselle de Maupin, right? Mademoiselle being the unmarried title, Madame, married woman, Mademoiselle, unmarried woman, and it's about a woman who is sort of involved with two men, right? But to one of them, she always dresses as a man, and he thinks that she is a man called Theodore, and to the other, she always appears as this woman, Rosamond, right? And so there's sort of this weird love triangle where she, with her cross-dressing, with her dressing up as a man and then as a woman, right? She is able to have these sort of split roles, right? Able to play around with gender. So obviously this is a theme around this time, right? It's to be considering about the role of women and how people perceive notions of gender. And of course we've already mentioned that he is romantic, friends with other romantic writers, and I guess as some of those earlier romantics got older, because he was a bit younger than them, sort of when they sort of went into retirement, he also was able to his fame sort of came to the fore. So, as I said, French, story published in 1836, right? And, of course, he is a leading romantic writer. Okay, so let's go over, before we get to the references and stuff, let's go over the details of what happened in this story, because like with some of the other stories, it is a little bit involved and has some twists and turns and so on that require us to think carefully about what happens in it. First of all, what perspective, what voice is this story told from? First person, right? When the narrator says, brother, is he talking to his brother? His literal brother born from the same mother as him? No, he's not, is he? He's talking to another priest, right? So in a sense, this is less just him saying, hey, I'm going to tell you a story, than it is a confession, isn't it? Right? This is framed as one priest confessing to another priest, right? This is what I've done with my life, right? So in the time that the story is being told, the narrator is how old? We're told he's 66, so he's an older man, but he's reflecting back upon some incidents that happened in his youth, right? And he's reflecting back here on some of the things that happened to him when he was younger. All right. So at the beginning of the story, this is framed as his confession, right? He's saying, this is what happened to me when I was younger. The clue that he says, he's saying this to his brother, not brother in the literal sense, but in the priestly figurative sense, right? That he is another priest. Okay. And he says how he has this sort of double life that he led when he was younger. On the one hand, he was a priest. On the other, in his dreams, he was having this weird affair, right, with a woman. Okay. So then he goes back to his youth and his childhood, right? And he talks about how he was raised in a very sheltered, very sort of enclosed background where he wasn't really exposed to the world much, didn't really learn about women and sex and marriage and all those sorts of things. And so the only thing that he was really passionate about, because of any of those other things, was his religion. And so, because he hasn't seen anything else, he thinks that, being a priest must be the pinnacle of existence, right? It's not hard to give up things when you don't know about them, right? So for him, all the sort of the temptations of the world of love and sex and partying and drinking and all those sorts of things, he doesn't know anything about them. So he's like, oh, well, being a priest must be the best thing there is. I will go and do that, right? So at the age of 24, right, we see that he finally goes through all of his training at the seminary, and he's ready to take his vows as a priest. And he looks around at all of his the fellow trainees, and he's like, what's with these guys? Why do they find this so hard? This is great. I'm going to be a priest. Right? And they're all like, oh, I'm going to have to give up so much. Instead, he's like, no, this is what I want. And so he's going through the ceremony to become a priest, right? All the religious rites and promises and so on. And he's standing up there at the front of the church, ready to, in front of the altar, ready to take his vows. And then he looks out and he sees this woman. And suddenly, for the first time, he's like, oh, I suddenly realize what I'm giving up, right? I'm attracted to this woman, and if I become a priest, I could never have her, right? And so it's this very ironic moment where he sort of it's only at the very, very, very last moment that he realizes that if he makes this decision to become a priest, he's not going to be able to pursue this woman. So this woman, of course, is Clarimonde. She's described in a great deal of detail as being this very beautiful woman. She seems to be sort of interacting with him secretly as the ceremony is being undertaken, trying to tempt him away. And he says that with all of his will, he wants to say, no, I don't want to become a priest. No, I've changed my mind. But instead, he sort of like watches himself sort of go up, say, yes, I'll take my vows, I'll do this. And he's like, no, I don't want to do it. But in his heart, he's saying this, but outwardly, he goes through all of the motions. And of course, the woman who's watching him is very disappointed by this. So he becomes a priest, right? The woman leaves disappointed. And then as he's leaving, she like touches his hand, they touch hands, right? Briefly, very cold hand, right? He notices that, he gets a message as he's going back from the ceremony back to the seminary. He gets a note with her name and where she lives on it. Right? And so he goes back to the seminary, and of course, now that he's a priest, he's got to go and like serve a church somewhere, right? So he leaves the city where he was doing his training, and he's driven out into the countryside by one of the other priests, Abbe Serapio, and the other priest like warns him, look, watch out, the devil's going to try and tempt you now that you're a priest, especially now that you're a priest. Right? He says it's going to make you even bigger prize for the devil, so you better watch out. Right? This is going to be something you have to take care of. Right? So he gets driven out to his new home, like he's the priest for this local church. He finds there was an older, like the guy obviously had died, like the previous priest that had been there. So like his dog and his caretaker and his house, he moves in there and he becomes the new local priest. So he's now in this new place, and he has a messenger come to him in the middle of the night, and this strange messenger tells him, "There's a woman dying. She needs you to come and say, like in the Catholic tradition, there are certain sacraments like taking Eucharist or communion or being baptized, all those sorts of things. There are also ceremonies for when you're about to die, right? So there's a ceremony that the priest does, last rites or extreme unction or any of those different names. And so often you try to get the priest to come when someone is dying so they can confess their sins and go through the ceremony and die in good standing with the church, right? So this is the purpose of that message, is to bring him as a priest. And so he goes to see this dying woman, and of course it turns out that the woman is Clarimonde, and he's too late, right? It's too late. She's already died. And they're like, well, you're too late to pray for her and to do all of the last rites with her, but at least you can come and see the body, right? And you can sort of pray there. So he goes to the room where the body is lying, and he looks at her, and he's like, wow, even when she's dead, she's extremely beautiful, right? And he has a very sort of strange moment with her where he's sort of like, well, if I just gave her a last kiss goodbye, right? And so he has these very strange fantasies in which he believes that like she sort of comes back to life and gives him the goodbye kiss, and then is like, thank you for helping me, thank you for being with me, and then she goes back to being dead. Right? He then, after this moment, after this weird kiss from the dead person, he sort of faints, wakes up 3 days later, he's in his own bed, and he's like, was it all a dream? Did I just imagine all this? But no, the housekeeper that he has says, no, I saw the messenger. You weren't dreaming all of that. It really happened, right? And so he then learns that Clarimonde had actually died at a big party, a big orgy that she'd been throwing a few days earlier, and the priest tells him, Serapion tells him that this doesn't seem to be the first time that this woman has died and come back. Right? And he believes that she is some sort of incarnation of the devil. Okay. So he thinks about these ideas, and in the middle of the night, when he's asleep, she comes to him in the dream, right? And she takes him away from his priestly home in his dream, right? She dresses him up in fine clothing. They go out to parties together. They sleep together. They do all sorts of things. They travel around the world together. And then when he wakes up, oh, I'm back in my priest's house, right? So he starts to live this strange double life where when he's asleep, right, he's with Clarimonde, and he's this handsome guy dressed in nice clothing and going to parties and traveling around the world, and he sort of says, my life as a priest seemed like a dream when I was that guy. And then when he wakes up, right, he's a priest, and he's like, oh, well, my life as Clarimonde's lover, that seemed like that was the dream, right? So he switches between these two different states. So he gets more and more immersed in this life with Clarimonde, but then one day he notices that she's putting something in his drink. He's like, why is she doing this? And he pretends only to drink it, instead throws out the contents of the drink, and he sees her sucking his blood, right? Taking blood from him. And he realizes, oh, this is why this woman keeps coming back. She's a vampire, right? But he also hears her say things about him that she's not, just doesn't seem to be an evil vampire, right? She seems to be one that says, oh, I'm faithful to you. I love only you. I'll only take a little bit of blood so that it doesn't hurt you, right? But nonetheless, he's kind of freaked out by this revelation, and so he goes to see again the Abbé, the mentor that he's had from the beginning of the story, and Serapion tells him, "Oh, I know what's going on here. We need to dig up the grave of Clarimonde, and we can work out what this mystery is." So they dig up her grave. Look, her body hasn't decayed at all, and then of course they destroy the body by exposing it, and that's the end of Clarimonde. But the narrator Romuald tells us that instead of solving his problems, right, instead of saying, "All right, I've been released from this, this horrible vampire, demon, devil, whatever you want to call her," instead at the end of the story he's like, "Yeah, she was a vampire, was sucking my blood and was making me do all these, these naughty things. God, I miss her." Right? He's like, "Oh, I wish I'd never gotten rid of her. I wish I'd never destroyed this vampire." Right? And that's where the story ends with. Instead, what we're expecting, of course, is that the story will end with saying, "And that's how I was saved. Thank God." Right? With this confession, but instead, the confession ends with him expressing regret. He's like, "I so wish that I just kept her alive and that I kept on giving her blood, and these dreams of me being her lover never ended." So we're all clear on the surface story there. We have three main characters, of course. We have Romuald, who is the narrator of the story. Right? We have Abbé Serapion, who is the mentor, the older priest who helps him out, and of course Clarimonde, who is the woman who is magically appears and appears to be a vampire of some kind. Okay. We have, of course, in the contents of the story, a number of clues, a number of references, a number of ideas. So let's go over some of those points quickly in the slides that I have for you. At the beginning of his confession, we have a reference to Sardanapalus, right? Sardanapalus, right? And he was in the ancient world, there are a number of different empires that ruled the Middle East, right? The Babylonians, there were the Assyrians, there were the Persians, there were the Greeks, right? Eventually the Romans, right? And so, of course, these different empires have become particularly famous in our, over time, because they've been tied up in histories of other things like the history of the Bible, right? So the accounts particularly of the Babylonian and the Assyrian attacks upon the countries of the other tribes of the Middle East have that significance, because amongst them were the Israelites, or the Jews, or what become the Jews, right? So Sardanapalus was an Assyrian king, right? Assyria, right? If you've ever seen, they have some of their statues are quite magnificent. If you see they have sort of these creatures that have big faces on them with big beards, and then they have these wings, wing victory sort of things. Anyway, that's their famous style. But Sardanapalus was the last of these Assyrian kings. And what you can see in this picture, which is also a romantic painting, right? You can see it's by another French artist, Eugène Delacroix, very famous French romantic painter. And you can see 1827 to 1828 is when he painted this. So it's right around the same time as these stories that we're reading. Okay. And what you're seeing here in this painting, well, can you tell me what's going on? I'll tell you who Sardanapalus is. He's this guy, right? Can you see what's happening here? What's going on in this painting?
People are being killed?
Yeah. People are being killed, not by Sardanapalus' people, but because this is the fall of the Assyrian Empire, right? And Sardanapalus being the last king of this great empire, right? These are basically his enemies, the conquerors, coming in, and they have defeated his armies, and now they have entered his palace, and they're killing his lovers and his wives and his concubines and other people that he's normally been partying with, right, and having fun with. These are the enemy soldiers that are coming in, and they're killing them all, right? So how does Sardanapalus reacting to this? Yeah. And that's part of what is this is why the narrator is comparing himself in this particular case, is that there's all this chaos and murder and bloodshed and everything is crumbling around Sardanapalus, and he's just kind of this party's boring, right? That seems to be his attitude. He just sort of sits there and watches as all of this mayhem unfolds around him, right? So the reason that the narrator of our story, Romuald, the reason that he makes this comparison is, first of all, he would have known at least, maybe even Gautier would have probably even seen this painting, because it's very famous, and Delacroix is a very famous romantic painter, right? But also because of this attitude, right? He's sort of like, there's all this chaos going on around me, but when I was young, I just sort of was like, oh, yeah, whatever, right? He's not really attached to it. He doesn't really see it when he's a young man, right? And that's why he makes this comparison. All this mayhem, all this craziness going on, but he alone is sort of calm and just sort of watching what's going on, okay? So yeah, this very famous painting, Delacroix, Sardanapalus, the last of the Assyrian kings, Assyrian emperors, and around him, all of his enemies coming in, murdering the people at his party, murdering his lovers and friends, and yet he just sits there and kind of watches, right, up in the corner. Okay, so as I said, the narrator using this comparison, he has all this craziness going around him, but he just sort of watches. Okay. We also have a reference on the second page of our story to that of Job, right? It says, truly spake Job when he declared that the prudent man is one who hath not made a covenant with his eyes, which actually, if you go and look at what Job actually says, it's the narrator completely takes what he's saying out of context and gets it very wrong. Because Job actually says, I made a contract with mine eyes. In other words, he's saying, I made a deal with my eyes that this is how I would see things. Right? So who is this guy Job? Who is he?
I don't know if it's the guy.
What book is he from?
Job.
Right, the book of Job, but it's contained within the Bible, right? So it's a biblical story. Yeah. Do you know anything else about him?
Yeah, he's the one who suffers a great deal and everything goes wrong in his life. His family dies and all that.
Yes. Yeah, and it's as a result, at the beginning of the book of Job, by the way, it's pronounced Job, not Job. So Job, at the beginning of the book, in the Bible, there's a discussion between God and the devil, right? And God and the devil have this discussion about like faith. And God says, well, you know, there are some good people who follow me. He's like, look, my guy Job is a good example. Right? And the devil says to him, well, the only reason that he likes you, the only reason he's faithful is because you're so nice to him. He's rich, he has a nice family, he's doing well, he's in good health, right? And God says, well, why don't you test his faith? Why don't you see if you take away all those things? Do what you like. You can do whatever you like, but you can't kill it, he says to the devil. So the devil goes in, kills his family, takes away all his wealth. You can see there he strikes him down with different diseases, right? To the point where Job is like, why is this happening to me? What did I do? Right? Why am I suffering like this? What did I do to deserve this? Right? He nonetheless does stay faithful to God, right? And eventually, everything. This is a part of the story I don't understand because, all right, everything is restored to him so he can get his money and his farms and his property back, but his family's not going to come back to life. They've been killed. Anyway, so Job, this figure of Job, has become a symbol of suffering, right? And having to deal with the question of like, why do humans suffer, right? Why do we get persecuted, right? And of course, again, just like Romuald is comparing himself in that first example to Sardanapalus, right? It's just sort of like treating everything, calmly watching everything, even though there's chaos around him. In this case, he's comparing himself to the suffering of Job, right? He's like, Job suffered at the hands of the devil. The devil did all these things to him, and yet he remained faithful. In the case of Romuald, right, he is tempted by this, evil spirit, Clarimonde, as a woman, comes down, does all these things to him, and he's like, I went through this suffering as well. And he does remain faithful, doesn't he? Right? He does remain a priest for the rest of his life. But we see that, unlike Job, our narrator Romuald has some feels rather more ambiguous about God and his choices in life than Job does. Okay. All right. Now, one of the other things to take into account too is, and this story is almost completely absent from the Bible. There is a very brief reference to the morning star falling out of the sky, but most of the mythology about Satan and the devil comes from outside of the Bible, comes from stories told after, right, that. And in particular, the story of Lucifer, right, who's supposed to be this extremely beautiful angel, represented here by the illustration by the English romantic poet William Blake. Right? This is meant to be Lucifer before he became the devil. Right? In other words, before he defied and rebelled against God, and then God casts him out of heaven, right, and into hell. And Lucifer takes a bunch of the angels with him, and they become the demons. So what Blake is representing here is, first of all, this idea that the devil, even though we usually have these sort of very medieval sorts of representations of him as ugly and not particularly attractive, nonetheless, we're told that he can still appear as this original Lucifer sort of figure, right? And it's important to note too that, you know, particularly for the Romantics, but not only the Romantics, but particularly for the Romantics, the devil and Satan are figures that they found, is a figure that they found very interesting from the Christian stories and Christian mythology. And if we think about those values of Romanticism we talked about at the beginning, right, nature, the emotions, and that sort of that outsider, misfit kind of individual, right? When we look at that third one, we can sort of see why, right? Because, you know, Lucifer, Satan, Beelzebub, whatever you want to call him, has those kind of misfit qualities as well, right? So this view of Satan as being this fairly interesting sort of villain character, right? And villains are usually interesting, right? They're usually interesting in various ways, often because they're charismatic or they're funny or they do things that we, you know, find both shocking but also kind of fascinating. So in the 1600s, the late 1600s, John Milton, famous English poet, rewrites the story of Genesis. And in it, he makes it a story of like God versus the devil. He sets up God as the protagonist and the devil as the antagonist, as the villain of this. And of course, what that does is it makes In Paradise Lost, the story that he tells, John Milton, therefore, even though he's not really trying to, he makes the devil, makes Satan into the most interesting character in that story, right? Because he says all sorts of rebellious things against God that even though they go against God's teachings, and Milton was a staunch Christian, nonetheless, some of the things that the devil says, or that Satan says in that book, are very interesting in the way he frames his arguments about freedom and defiance and rebellion, right? Things that would, you know, with things like the French Revolution would become part of like the everyday sort of politics of the time. So this use of Satan or the devil and so on becomes a big part, sometimes indirectly, like in a story like Clarimonde, right, where we're not really sure that Clarimonde is the devil. We're not even really sure if she's a vampire as such in the traditional sort of sense. But other stories, other poems, other works that come from this Romantic period sometimes directly address or retell the story of the fall of Satan. So there is a famous poem by Victor Hugo, the other French Romantic that we mentioned, right, called La Chute, the Fall, right, in which, again, like Milton, he retells the story, and this time of the fall of Adam and Eve, but this time he retells it from the perspective of Satan, right? He retells it from this perspective of like why Satan does what he does, why he rebels, and why he's this interesting, complex sort of character from the perspective of the Romantic protagonist. Okay. So this double sort of side to the devil, right? That he's originally an angel, and so he was on God's side and was good, and then becomes something that becomes the symbol of evil and ugliness, right? The fact that he still has these two capabilities, that he's able to still appear as an angel and to trick people into believing that he's an angel, right? And on the other hand, that he has like this capability of being evil and tricking people with his evil and the things that he does in that way, right? This shows to us particularly in this story, but we've already seen it in many, many, many of the other romantic stories that we've read, that there is this kind of duality, two sides to human beings, right? So we've seen our characters often being split, as we saw in our midterm exam, for example, where we talked about like those conflicting values, right? Should I be good? Should I be evil? I have both in me, right? Which side am I going to choose, right? Or if you're Don Juan in Balzac's the Elixir of Life story, like, I should help my dad, right? He's dying and he's been good to me and it's my duty, but I want to party and I want to sleep with women and I want to have pleasure. Which one am I going to choose, right? So repeatedly we see in these stories, right, there are these conflicts where the two sides of humans, two opposite sides, inhabit the same person, right? They have both of these capacities. And it sort of often tears them apart or leads them into great big conflicts with themselves, right? So, I mean, of course, this is comical taken from The Simpsons, but like the representation of like the angel and the devil sort of like being on the shoulder of the same person. Hey, do this, no, do this, right? Leading us in two different directions. We see this very clearly in this story, and particularly, of course, through the symbolism of the dreams, right? It's almost like he says, I was two different people, right? He talks about I was two different people at once. I was leading these two different lives, right? Romuald tells us in the story. And so he's like, and yet he says at the same time, it was still me, right? I knew about these two sides, these two different people, right? So this is, of course, something that we see both in this story, we see it in other romantic stories, we'll see it in stories still to come, right? And of course, even in later literature that's influenced by this. Think of, like the Stevenson story, Robert Louis Stevenson story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Again, has the same thing, where they're the same person, and yet they have these two split different personalities to them, right? Okay. Now, towards the end of our story, we have a couple of references to, first of all, to Belshazzar, and this is a very similar kind of story to the Sardanapalus story, insofar as these are both kings or emperors who are at the end of the empire, right? Belshazzar was the last of the Babylonian Empire, right? And this famous story, again told in the Bible, right, has Belshazzar is holding a party, and then God actually comes down and using, I guess there must have been a lot of dust or something on the wall, and God, using his finger, right, writes a message in, I guess it must have been in Hebrew, on the wall, right? And of course, Belshazzar being Babylonian, he's like, I can't read that. What does it say, right? And so he brings one of the Hebrews in and he reads it. It says, like, basically, it's over. You're done. Your empire is about to fall. And so Belshazzar, yeah, whatever. I'm the king. It doesn't matter. And then, of course, we have a scene just like in the Sardanapalus where his enemies break into the palace, they take over, and the empire falls, right? So both of those stories, both Sardanapalus and Belshazzar, they're both kings who are at the end of this great reign. It's their downfall. It's their moment, not just of decline, but actually of fall. And then, of course, Cleopatra, too, right, is another of those sorts of leaders as well, right? Cleopatra, who had sort of the heights of her political career, right? First of all, she has an affair with, of course, she was the queen of Egypt, right? And she has an affair with Julius Caesar. In fact, she has a son by Julius Caesar, right? And then she later on gets together with Mark Antony, right? Not the contemporary Mark Antony, the singer, right? Not the ancient one. And So she has this very successful political career for a while, but eventually she's conquered, it all falls apart. And so what you're seeing here is this is the scene of her death. And she was, a pretty tough woman, it seems anyway, at least from the myths that we're told about her. And so rather than being captured or being killed by the enemy soldiers, she decides that she's going to kill herself. And the way that she does it is she takes a poisonous snake, right? And she gets it to bite her on the breast, inject its poison into her. And so that's what you're seeing here, is that she has the snake in her hand, right? And she's let it bite her, and now she's dead, okay? So we have these references here, and also there's all sorts of other rumors about Cleopatra and the Egyptian mythology and so on as well, but we won't go into those. Okay, now notice too, I highlighted this last time with Zambonella. I told you she was wearing the dress with the blue flowers on it when she goes to the party with Sarrazin, and I said to you that like the reference here is a very common one in Romantic literature to the blue flowers as representing like this perfect ideal, this unattainable ideal, right? This perfection that in Novalis' work, the main character, Heinrich, is looking for this blue flower, which represents like perfection, right? And where does this blue flower turn up again in our story today?
Is it when she's dead and there's blue flowers in her hair?
Yeah, right? So, and it actually appears twice when he initially sees her dad and there's the blue flowers there, and then when she sort of comes back to life, the blue flowers are sort of, they're all shriveled and dead, right? Symbolically. Right? To say like the ideal has sort of died. It's not really perfect after all. So the blue flowers, like if you see this in Romantic literature, Romantic stories, it's almost certainly going to be this reference back to the Novalis story, right? To this symbol that he popularized. Okay. Now, one other thing that we've seen in a lot of our stories is that of the use of the dream, right? And the dream, of course, is used here as being sort of a parallel to or an additional way of using your imagination, or if we use the term that's very common in this Romantic time, your fancy, right? Your imagination. And so here, of course, dreams, of course, are not real, right? They're part of an extension of like what our mind imagines. And so what we see happening in a lot of these stories is that the Romantics use dreams in stories as this way of sort of providing an extension of the imagination, an extension of the imagination into an area where we sometimes can't be sure about whether something is real or not, right? Because this, of course, happens to us, doesn't it? Especially if we wake up from a very vivid dream. Sometimes we're like, that? Well, you wake up, you have a... So I've had this a couple of times where in my dream, I've had a fight with someone who's like a friend of mine, and then I wake up and I'm mad at my friend for no reason, right? Because I dreamt about it. Well, the same thing is something that the authors of these stories play with, although in a more extreme sort of way, is that they use the dream as the extension of the imagination of the characters, right? They imagine these things, or in other cases, they dream these things, but of course they're all, neither of them is real. They're all within the imagination. Now, one of the other things that is interesting about the way in which Gautier uses this device of the dream, right, is that for Romuald, our narrator, he uses it as an excuse, doesn't he? Because he says, I dreamt it. I can't control my dreams, right? I can't decide that I'm going to be this way in my dreams and I will do this and I will behave this way and be a good person. So one of the things that notice that this is one of the things that he does to sort of like excuse himself, to say, well, I wasn't really being sinful, was I? I mean, I went off in my dreams. Yeah, I had these affairs and I was with this woman and, you know, I was breaking my vows as a priest and I was doing all sorts of naughty things in my dreams. But that's not my fault, is it? I didn't decide to dream that, right? I didn't decide to do these things. And so he uses this as a kind of excuse, a way of saying, it wasn't me, right? But notice then he also sort of sets up his own actual life in the same way as well. He sort of says, well, then my real life became kind of like a dream, which I couldn't control either. Okay. So yeah, that was the last one. Yes, so this dream as the extension of the imagination, of the fancy, Gautier uses it in this way as a way of both of focusing upon that question of the imagination we've seen in many of the romantic fiction, but also getting Romuald to question how much of this is he responsible for, right? How much of this can we say, oh, you're a bad guy, you're sinful, you were, you know, having this affair with this Clarimonde, and how much of it is, I couldn't do anything about it, right? I was possessed. These dreams are not something I can control. All right, so let's turn to our homework sheets and see what are some of the ideas that we picked up for this particular story. Let's see, who'll be my first victim. Sharon, would you like to begin today, please?
Choose the second last paragraph on page 145.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with one drop and then one drop.
Mm-hmm.
I think this paragraph describes how much she loves him and how much she's willing to sacrifice for him. Like she sacrifices her health and her life for his happiness, but he can't seem to do the same for her.
Mm-hmm.
And like she changes for him. It describes how like instead of drinking other lovers' blood, she only drinks his, and like she's really careful to not hurt him, but he can't seem to completely give up like his other life or change for her. And he keeps like reassuring the audience that he loves her, but he like passively allows Yabed to kill her.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of contradicting elements. Like his thoughts are very different from his actions.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many elements in the story where it blurs the lines between reality and his dreams. Like his dreams feel real, and reality feels like a dream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially the scene where he's called away in the middle of the night, right? And he's like, did I dream that like I went, like some messenger came and we rode on these really weird horses, and like he's sort of like, is that all a dream? So you're right, there's, because of this conflict within this character, right? Obviously there's a lot of contradictions that then arise out of the things that he thinks and the ways that he behaves. But let me ask you, like obviously this is not going to be real, but if you had a vampire lover, right, who was drugging you to steal your blood, would you think that, hey, they're a nice guy or they're a nice girl, you know, I'd make the sacrifice of changing for them?
Not really.
No, because he's already said, like, he's already realized that, like, she's kind of tricking and manipulating him, isn't he? Because he actually says, like, part of what leads him to make the decision to, like, go to the other priest and tell him about it was that he sort of says, like, if she'd just come to me and said, hey, I'm a vampire, I need to drink your blood, he's like, go ahead, you know, take as much as you want, right, is what he says. But because she does it in this secret way, right, because she's drugging him and then like pricking his finger and drinking just a little bit, he's like, that's what bothers him, right? So maybe if this was a healthy relationship, I can see where your point is, but there seem to be some other contradictory parts about it, don't there? It's like, we're sort of like, how healthy really is this relationship between the two of them? Obviously, he still regrets that he ended it, right? And there's certain similarities even to other stories. You could think of Passion in the Desert as well. Remember, there's the sort of the death by misunderstanding of the big cat, right? And which ends in regret. Same thing here, right? Okay, Nam here.
I take page 135.
135.
The last paragraph.
Yep.
Here our main character kind of like complaining about his becoming a priest, and he kind of thinking, oh, I could have been a rich guy having those affairs with beautiful women,
Mm-hmm.
and beautiful women. But I think the meeting with the ceremony is kind of like a Caesar's cut our protagonist into two people, have two personalities. One is still have faith in his God, but the other one's like a young man, have all those sexual desires for women, especially for those beautiful ones.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think this kind of contradicting values in these two personalities really causes him a lot of sufferings we can see in the later part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And is it like, if he had just gone and become a priest and never seen Clarimonde, would his faith be very strong or very good?
No.
Because when you have someone who's like entirely sheltered and who's never been tempted, and they think, oh, I'll become a priest, life is like this, and they just become a priest, and he never has any of those temptations or anything. It means that his faith has never really been tested, right, doesn't it? It means he's never really been tempted, and therefore his faith as such is not really worth all that much, right? It's not really being tried in any sort of way. So there's a sense in which, you know, he needs almost to go through this process to have a more real kind of faith. And that's kind of what like his mentor, Serapion, says to him. He sort of like, you know, well, the devil, you know, he'll come test you, but that will just show how much, you know, your virtue is really worth. Right? Okay, Asuria?
Same page, third paragraph.
Sorry, which page?
135.
135, yep. Mm-hmm.
I really need to close my eyes in order to see her distinctly. I think this sentence indicates that Clarimonde might be just an imaginary figure that he has just made up in his mind. Also, what she said to him, like, unhappy man, not just what she actually said to me, but like he regards his lives.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like, unhappy.
Like Sharon said, a lot of the reality becomes very sort of like more like a dream than the dreams that he has, the actual dreams that he has. So that this scene where he's in the church taking his vows, you're sort of like thinking, well, how does no one else notice that there's this woman flirting with him, right? Saying, hey, come with me, right? How does no one else who is taking all the vows and the priest and all the audience and so on, how does no one else notice her, right? And like the answer to that, as you said, it seems like it's possible that like this woman doesn't really exist, right? I mean, we're told even by the narrator that like as far as he's concerned, physically, he never left his little church in the countryside, right? That he always was there, and that he only ever left it in his dreams, right? He says, oh, yeah, you know, I did all sorts of bad things, I traveled all sorts of different places, but it wasn't me as such. It was just in my dreams that I did these things, right? So for these lines between the imagination and the dreams and the reality, because they're so blurred, even this scene, like that you pick out, right? We're sort of like, did this really happen? Is this? I mean, not that we're saying absolutely it didn't, but it's left so uncertain, so unclear, right? So yes, he has these doubts, but also this encounter with this woman that is very, very dreamlike, very strange, very sort of unrealistic in its description. Okay, is that?
I picked page 138, paragraph 3, just the last paragraph. When he's getting taken away by the weird guy. And that just kind of like foreshadows the rest of the story, because it's kind of mysterious and weird and dark. And it kind of has a little like sublime aspect to it too, because all these weird things are happening and he's going through the forest and seeing all these like weird animals. And also I thought that like the horses could symbolize like the nightmares themselves, so it could show that kind of he was in a dream, like kind of a scary, weird, spooky dream.
Yes, and actually the references directly there. It says, he said if someone had seen them, like his guide and himself, he said, he must have taken us for two specters, right, two ghosts, riding upon nightmares, right? And remember we saw earlier in the semester that like this term nightmare comes from this sort of myth that like you have bad dreams from like an evil horse that rides through your dreams, right? So the nightmare and the horses, yeah, there is this direct parallel there. And notice too that this is a very Gothic sort of scene, isn't it? Right? We have this, the setting, the atmosphere is set by the surroundings of the characters. And of course it connects in various other sort of Gothic settings that we've seen too, such as, for instance, what are some other stories that we've seen that have used this kind of setting to Fall of House of Usher, right? Or in this particular scene set in the forest, where else did we see that kind of scary setting? Yeah, young Goodman Brown, right? So remember, he hears all these things, he sees all these things, and yet he's not sure whether they were sort of a dream or reality in that story as well, right? So you can see once we start to compare these stories that we've read previously to what we're reading now, there are these patterns, there are these same sort of like devices and styles and ideas and symbols that are used over and over again, so that the more familiar we become with romanticism and romantic fiction, the more we can see these patterns at work, and it becomes easier to read and to understand these stories. Okay. Gustav, how about you?
Two paragraphs. On first one on page 145, the second one on page 147, the last one, and on page 145, the second from the bottom. And this is first the paragraph where we see how intense that love is. This is really remarkable that he doesn't say, okay, stop, Claremont, I'm awake, and stop taking my blood, but he lets her drink, and then taking into account that last paragraph, I question how evil this whole relationship really is. I mean, it gives him quite something and makes him happy. So can we really just say this is the evil part of his life, and the life he leads when he's awake is the good part? I don't think it's that evil.
Yes, and notice too, both those paragraphs you picked out as well, he questions the amount of choice that he really has in these relationships as well, right? So on 145 there, in about 2/3 of the way down that paragraph, he says, I could not cease to love Claremont, right? And this is the part where I said he would have given her whatever blood that she needed, right? He's like, I couldn't stop myself, right? It wasn't like I just decided, hey, I love you or I don't love you. It's like I had no choice, right? I couldn't do anything about it. And then he sort of says, like at the end of the story too, like about how much regret that he has, because well, even though supposedly she was a vampire and she was preying upon him and she was evil, etc., he's like, it wasn't so bad. I didn't mind. I'll give her blood. I loved her. Yeah, I wanted to continue it, right? It was weird, but I liked it, right? And so he sort of has this sort of saying, basically he's been living with this regret, and he can't rid himself of it, right? He's like, I wish I could just forget about it. I wish I could just stop regretting it. I wish I could stop thinking about it. But even now I'm old and I'm approaching death and so on, I can't stop thinking about it. I still want it. I still wish I hadn't killed her, right? So there's like this ambiguity to his choice that, of course, Gautier is deliberately doing this, right? He's deliberately getting us to question what the normal kind of, like we sort of normally would say, oh, priest good, vampire bad, right? And we have that very easy sort of separation between those two things. But Gautier is getting, well, actually, for this guy, right? In his case, it seems like his love with Clarimonde was a good thing for him, right? And being the priest was maybe not so good, right? And this is particularly given to us in the clues about this are given in the way in which his mentor, Serapion, approaches the way in which he kills Clarimonde, right? This is on page 146 in the middle, right? And when they go together to the grave and they dig up Clarimonde, Romuald notices something about the other priest. Because he thinks like, well, the other priest thinks, oh, I'm the good guy. I'm killing the vampire. I'm getting rid of the evil spirit. But Romuald looks at Serapion's face and he's like, yeah, there's something that's not really all that angelic or good about what this guy is doing, right? So right in the middle of that page, it says, there was something grim and fierce in Serapion's zeal which lent him the air of a demon rather than an apostle or an angel. And his great aquiline face with all its stern features brought out in strong relief by the lantern light had something fearsome in it, which enhanced the unpleasant fancy. I felt an icy sweat come over my forehead in huge beads, and my hair stood up with a hideous fear. From the depths of my own heart, I felt that the act of the austere Serapion was an abominable sacrilege. Right? So what he discovers here is that, just as he has this dual thing where he's like, I'm supposed to be a good guy, a good priest, and yet I'm doing this supposedly bad thing with Clarimonde, Gautier also reverses it so that the other priest is supposed to be doing this supposedly good thing, but when Romuald looks at him doing it, he's like, this guy is not a good guy, right? He's doing this for evil reasons. Yeah.
When we add the paragraph on page 141, the second one, where he describes how Clarimonde died,
Mm-hmm.
he asks himself, where does he know that from? That much in detail. So combining these two might lead us to the result that he was maybe closer to Clarimonde than he should have been.
Yes, you're right. So there's also the what is the connection between Serapion and Clarimonde? Does he have other ulterior motives for why he is so interested in this woman, right? That aren't made clear to us as well, right? So you're right. We have the right to be suspicious about these parts of the story, right? And to suspect that maybe what underlies the good is not always so good, and maybe what underlies evil is not always so evil. But there is, a kind of a relative process here that's at work. Okay, let's see. Minho, how about you?
I picked on page
145. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So on this paragraph, even though he comes to know that she was a vampire,
Mm-hmm.
he is willing to give her his blood. He always yields to her temptation, which is contrast to his religious belief.
Mm-hmm.
So his thought that there is no problem with giving her his blood comes not from that he thinks by himself, but from that Clarimonde infuses that idea.
Mm-hmm.
So this reveals that he is totally tempted into evil, and the power of evil is too powerful to get out of it, even he is a priest.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I mean, this is certainly another way we've been giving a more sympathetic reading of Clarimonde, but as you said, we can also read her, potentially she is evil, like I was saying to Sharon, like if you're in this kind of parasitic relationship, like, I mean, obviously vampires don't exist, but if this was theoretically us in this position, right, we would be thinking, wait a minute, like, should I be being drugged and people stealing my blood without, like, does someone who really loves you, would they really do it that way, right? And so it's the secrecy, it's the potential evil behind the way in which she does it, right? That is problematic here. Also, I mean, that scene where he's by the body, right, also has a very sort of like creepy, perverse sort of sense to it, doesn't it? Because he's sort of like, he's seeing a dead woman, and he's sort of like, oh, she's really attractive, even though she's dead. She's like, oh, I shouldn't kiss her. Oh, but so there's this sort of like this weird sort of necrophiliac moment that he has, where, and then of course he imagines, or does he imagine, that she wakes up and kisses him and then goes back to being dead again, right? So like a lot of those scenes, like the kiss of the dead woman, the scene in the church where she seduces him during his priest ceremony, like a lot of these things we really can't tell whether they're real or in his imagination, right? Because they're so ambiguous, they seem so unrealistic as to what could actually be happening there. Right. Justin, what about you?
Last paragraph from 147.
Mm-hmm.
Ending.
So the ending, yep.
And he's talking about how he regrets killing her.
Yep.
And he talks about how, like, never to gaze upon a woman and walk abroad only with eyes ever fixed upon the ground. And after, like, that was when he was younger, and this is when he's talking about after he's grown up.
Mm-hmm.
So that one experience has affected his entire view of women and everything about that.
Yes. And of course, when he says at the end there, the error of a single moment, we don't know whether he means, falling in love with Clarimonde or killing Clarimonde, right? That's also an ambiguous statement there. Like, which one is the mistake?
Becoming a priest.
Or becoming a priest, yeah. Like, so, like, there is a whole, like, series of possible interpretations of that phrase, right? Which one is it that he actually means? Now, just a final note here too, the significance of the blood. We've already talked, about how in this time there is a change going on. It's social change with regard to like those ideas of the aristocracy, right? And particularly because, remember, the idea of the aristocracy was that your worth was determined by what family you were born into. And this was often talked about as being represented by blood, right? So there's a whole series of symbolisms to the vampire and to the blood. Notice she says that he has noble and rich blood in him, right? This guy that is in our story, he wasn't born into a poor family, right? He was obviously born into a rich aristocratic family, right? Upper class sort of family. Because not only does she say that he has noble blood that is more like refreshing to her, but also that at other points he says, I could have been, a rich playboy and going around and having fun and dressing in rich clothing and other stuff like that, right? So this guy is from this aristocratic background. There's a certain political symbolism to that background, and also, of course, blood in the Christian religion also has a lot of symbolism with regard to like the idea that like sin can only truly be redeemed, can only be forgiven by the shedding of blood. Right? So Paul says this in Romans. So, of course, even within the Eucharist, the communion, right? The wine is meant to represent blood of Christ. Yeah. So there is a whole lot of like overlapping symbolism here too, with the drinking of the blood having both religious symbolism and also this political symbolism of the aristocracy too. Can be further explored. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you guys. Enjoy your weekend. We'll read some more wholesome, fulfilling stories about wonderful people falling in love, right? More dead people falling in love with living people. But yeah, that's for next week.